I want to ask you to stop being wrong about context. And I'm coming at this from a Western Australian point of view using the Western Australian curriculum. The definition that we get in Western Australia for context is that it is the environment in which a text is responded to or created. Context can include the general social, historical, and cultural conditions in which a text is responded to and created, which is the context of culture, or the specific features of its immediate environment, which is the context of situation. So that's the definition we have. The definitions in New South Wales, Victoria, states in the US, UK, they might be slightly different, but this is the definition we're using for the purposes of this video. So an example of what students get wrong is that they talk about To Kill a Mockingbird and its context as being the 1930s in the Great Depression. And I'm going to put to you that that's an incorrect use of the word context, and I would like to explain why. Let's start by agreeing on certain things first. The context of Lord of the Rings is not Middle-earth. The context of Star Wars is not a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. The context of Gladiator is not ancient Rome. Nazi Germany is not the context of Jojo Rabbit. Jasper Jones's context is not 1960s rural Western Australia. And then the context of To Kill a Mockingbird is not Great Depression era USA. But Harper Lee grew up in the 1930s in the Great Depression. I can hear many of you yelling. And you're right, that does give a certain angle where you could argue that informs the context of the writer. Yes, Craig Silvey grew up in WA Southwest. Yes, that would inform the context of the writer and could be drawn into that. Good job, champ. But 99 students out of 100 won't be saying that when they're talking about those contexts. They'll be talking about the context of the world in that text being the context of those texts. And it's incorrect. Now, while you have a point that To Kill a Mockingbird is unique because the author grew up in the world that she represents 30 years later, I'm going to put it to you that there are more interesting and richer ways to write about the novel. But let's look at that way first. I could write about the context of the novel being that To Kill a Mockingbird, the context of To Kill a Mockingbird is the Great Depression of the 1930s because this is the social context from which Lee draws her material. But I don't think I would say anything interesting there. I could still write about that period as being what the novel represents, but I'd much rather not write about that as the context of the novel. I'd much rather say that the context of To Kill a Mockingbird is the 1960s because of the emergence of the civil rights movement, and that created an audience who'd be persuaded by the representation of America's brutal racism. So this is the context of when the novel was written or published. And I think I could discuss the representation of the 1930s as a reflection of the concerns of the world in the 1960s USA. Notice how I've said that the discussion, I can discuss the representation of the 30s as a reflection of the concerns or the context of the world in the 1960s. I could also write that the context of my own reading, the context of response to To Kill a Mockingbird is influenced by the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and systematic injustice faced by people of color today in the USA. And I reckon I could connect the representation of the 1930s to the current concerns of audiences. So what should we write about the context of texts with fascinating historical settings? Well, let's start with Gladiator. The context of Gladiator is not ancient Rome. The context of Gladiator is the year 2000, United States, through a search for moral leadership, the representation of a domestic hero, spectacles of violence, and decaying empires. In terms of a search for moral leadership, the film comes out of a context where America had just come out of the presidency of Bill Clinton, not particularly known for his moral leadership given his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. We've got an emerging thing in cinema where the heroes become like everyday people, like Bruce Willis in Die Hard. In this case, we have a general stripped of all his armor, and he basically just becomes a dad avenging the murder of his wife and child. We become increasingly interested in spectacles of violence with the emergence of reality TV in the 1990s, and with the decaying of empires. By year 2000, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union was collapsed. America was the last great superpower. And there's this interesting discussion going on about the decaying of great empires. But 25 years later, we have a sequel. And this sequel shifts things. And so in the context of production, it becomes particularly interesting. There's a nuanced view of masculinity being represented. There's a diversity in representation in the choice of cast for the film, reflecting the concerns of 2025. There's a critique of power that is different to what 2000 was interested in. Instead of the decaying of empires, and instead of the moral leadership, we have a concern with the nature of power in the 2025 context. And franchise culture influences just the fact that this film was even made. This film comes about through a period in film history right now where instead of coming up with original content, Hollywood is trawling through old content and trying to establish franchises, such as the Marvel franchise. Moving into Django Unchained, awesome Quentin Tarantino film. If you're looking at that as a history lesson in pre-Civil War America, you are going to be wrong. But it reflects and reveals the concerns of its 2025 context. In a 2012 context, rather, it is grappling with its race history, including representation. This is right in the middle of Obama-era America, and race relations in America are a massive conversation at that time. It's also a reflection of postmodern trends in film to create meta-narratives, this self-aware narrative, and revisionist histories. Tarantino made 3 films where he completely alters the histories. Spoiler alerts ahead. We have Django Unchained, which upends the Civil War era to create an African-American hero who basically kills all the slave owners, which is like a wishful look at that history. Then you have Inglourious Bastards, in which you see Adolf Hitler and the top Nazis being executed and burned alive in a cinema in Paris. Obviously, that never happened. And then we have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which revisits and reinvents the murder of Sharon Tate by Charles Manson's followers. So this is a very 2012 to 2020 kind of concern happening here. It's born of its context. Then we have the Amazon Prime series called The English. It's a Western, but it reflects and reveals the concerns of 2022 by decolonizing the Western genre, making it less about the heroic exploits of Europeans taming the West. And it's a series where the concerns and interests of First Nations Americans are foregrounded, and where the main hero of this is a woman. So it represents the conversations about gender and power that are current in 2022, and is a concern for psychological depth rather than pure action. So the English, the context of the English is not the American West. The American West is being represented, but the context is 2022. If we get into Rabbit-Proof Fence from here in Australia, it reflects and reveals the concerns of 2002. It is not about, its context is not the period that it represents. The context is 2002, with Australia having a reckoning with its history of stolen generations, Australia's concern for reconciliation with First Nations peoples, Australia's renewed focus on national identity. This is coming right off the back of the Sydney Olympics, where Australian identity and being Australian was the most awesome thing in the world. And this brings it into question, but brings into questions of what it means to be Australian. Particularly in that Olympics, we have Kathy Freeman winning that awesome gold medal. And right on the heels of that, we have this brilliant film here, questioning Australia's past with its First Nations peoples. And then we have this emerging idea of representation in film, to have First Nations peoples not just being represented, but playing the roles that are in there, rather than like in American Westerns in the past, you would have Burt Lancaster playing a First Nations person. So I'm suggesting to you that the least interesting thing about text set in another time are the social concerns of the world in that text. What's more interesting is the way the text represents the social concerns of the world in the text, and reflects and reveals the social concerns and ideas in the world when the text was created or consumed. So let me just restate that. When you refer to the setting of historical text as the context, you're almost always wrong. Stop being wrong. Turn it into a window. Write about that setting in terms of the concept of representation. Gladiator represents ancient Rome. Django Unchained represents pre-Civil War America. The English represents colonial America, rabbit-proof fence represents that early stolen generation's Western Australia. The context for those films are the context when they were created and the context of when they are being responded to. I hope that gives you some clarity around what context actually means so that you can write about it with some authority in your own writing. Good luck with that.